So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview. Recorded live, I studied French New Wave cinema in college. Took it twice, in fact, in Professor Robert Ray's class at the University of Florida. Little known fact, my degree is actually in film studies. Anyway, I love the French New Wave, the films from the late 50s and early 60s. What I didn't care for was the overinflated discussion that followed each screening. I'd watch the movies in all of the storytelling, the jump cuts, the women, the casual sex, you get the idea. But when the lights came up, Professor Ray always insisted on going deep into the meaning and motivation of the filmmaker. Well, so here I am, Mr. A Mile Wide and an Inch Deep, about to welcome the esteemed film critic of the New Yorker magazine and author of the new book, Everything is Cinema, The Working Life. Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard. It's a fascinating look at the best of French New Wave, the auteur behind Breathless, A Woman is a Woman, La Chinoise, and King Lear, and many more. And it made me wish I was more patient back in Professor Ray's class more than 25 years ago. Richard, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks.
I hope I didn't scare you off with my introduction where I admitted that I'm really just a cinematic dope.
No, absolutely not. I think that the French New Wave is meant to be watched more than it's meant to be talked about.
Oh, my God. I love you. Can we talk about all movies? And I have to run this by you here at the beginning. Parlez-vous français, mon ami?
Mais oui, je parle français.
I was afraid of that. Okay. We're done with the French now. But I just had to be sure I was talking to the right guy.
It would have been tough to do a book like this without French.
Well, that's what one would assume for sure. So let me start with a question I would have asked in college, and we'll graduate from there, okay? So bear with me here. Do you think, I'm very serious now, do you think that Star Trek's Jean-Luc Picard was named for Jean-Luc Godard? Very important question.
I do.
You do?
I do. I believe that Jean-Luc Godard was an extremely big celebrity to anybody who was involved in the film business in the 1960s and 70s. I think the name certainly comes from there. I don't think there's any connection, but I think that the name is intended to suggest awareness of the filmmaker's existence.
Well, you know what, Richard, just for playing along with me on my stupidity, I'm going to hold up your book right now in front of the video on the web chat that goes with this, and I'm going to mention the title again. It is Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard. How about that?
That's terrific.
Just for making me feel good. So, how did you happen to light on Godard as a subject for your first book? I mean, it obviously involved years of work and a substantial commitment to, one person's body of work.
Mm-hmm. From a personal point of view, it was Godard's films that started me in the cinema. When I was in college and had more or less no particular interest in movies except as Saturday night entertainments, it was Breathless, which I happened to see on a friend's recommendation, that led me to believe that the movies were an art form, that made me understand that movies could be as intellectually as exciting as jazz or philosophy or books or the other things that I cared about. From a historical perspective, I think that Godard's films are the central body of work in the cinema of the last 50 years. He is the Picasso or the Schoenberg of cinema. He undid the existing conventions and attempted to reconstruct the medium on the basis of a new historical perspective.
Wow. I would agree. In thinking back in reading through the book, and I was particularly taken with the chapter on Breathless, because it is the film that most people identify with Godard. And I'm going to drop the second D now that I've heard you pronounce it. I'm going to drop the second D as much as I can. It is a really monumental film. Maybe you want to talk about it a little bit. It's the one that people who really don't have the devotion to cinema that you do, and I like to think that I do. It's the one Godard film that I think most people have some familiarity. They've either seen it or they know of it. let's talk a little about that film. What is it that about that film that's so special?
One of the reasons why people remain devoted to Breathless is because of the films on which it's based. In effect, Godard was attempting to make a French version of American film noir. He was attempting to make an American B-movie, an American B-gangster movie. And it's his playfulness in doing so that accounts for a great deal of the film's enduring appeal. But it's also where a lot of the misunderstandings come from. Because of the film's Hollywood roots and tributes and homages, it looks as if Godard was really attempting to make an American-style film, whereas in fact what he was doing was using the conventions of the Hollywood-style film to criticize the conventions of the medium and to make a film very much in the French intellectual tradition, specifically in the tradition of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist philosophy. Mm-hmm. He was using a film noir to make the first existentialist film.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, which is to say that he was using expressly non-intellectual material and turning it into a work of modern art. Somewhat like pop art.
Like Popeye?
Pop art. Pop art.
Oh, pop. I'm sorry. That's why I laughed. I thought you said Popeye. Pop art, of course. Is it that complicated to understand Godard and the other French New Wave filmmakers, or is it, I don't know. Sometimes I think that intellectuals tend to make so much of things like this that it makes it impenetrable for other people just because they don't think they'll ever understand it.
I think it depends on the film that we're talking about specifically, but I think that in terms of Godard, one of the great paradoxes is that the films exist on a number of different levels, many of which are not immediately accessible to a viewer. Mm-hmm. I do think that he was attempting to create an emotional experience, although in an atypical way. I don't think he ever attempted to generate a strong identification on the part of the viewer with his characters, but rather simply to generate emotions through a kind of symbolism, through a kind of through subtle touches which are themselves more under the surface than the relationship of a viewer to the character. I think the primary identification he was trying to effect was of the viewer with himself. In other words, he was trying to project the sense of a person thinking and making films and feeling in real time.
I love the detail that you go into in the particularly, and again the chapter on Breathless. There's so much there. I say in the introduction that reading the book made me wish I had been more patient in Professor Ray's class. I don't know that I was capable of being more patient at the time, but it really is interesting to go and read that so many of these takes, these scenes were done in one shot, but he obviously Godard obviously took what he was doing extremely seriously. I mean, one of the things I wondered about is, did people at the time, besides Godard and people writing for Cahiers du Cinéma, did everyone take the cinema in France as seriously as these guys did, or were they at the cusp of something different?
They spearheaded a new form of passion for the cinema. Godard and a circle of critic friends, including François Truffaut, Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, and the elder among them, Eric Romer, were at a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, where they came up with and advocated a critical line that they called the politique des auteurs, which we know as the auteur theory. The idea being that the director of a film, even a Hollywood film made within the strictures of the studios, could be artists as personal and free as the writers of books, but that it took a form of discerning criticism to detect the personal marks of filmmakers in Hollywood movies. There was a great deal of enthusiasm for movies in France in the post-war period. And for that matter, there was a great deal of popular interest in Hollywood cinema. But what the young critics of the forthcoming new wave, of the young critics of Cahiers were doing, was advocating certain Hollywood filmmakers they loved as the equals of directors from anywhere in the world and the equals of artists in any other medium. In effect, what they were doing was creating a canon of artists which they were themselves planning to take their place in. But yes, serious moviegoing took place. France was always serious about moviegoing. There was in France that movies were first called the seventh art. It was in France where Henri Langlois founded the Cinémathèque, the seminal museum of movie preservation and movie projection, where the French New Wave did a great deal of their viewing. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote at length about movies. There was a great deal of intellectual ferment around the cinema in France. So that was the environment in which the New Wave sprang up. A very serious critic named André Bazin, one of the great film theoreticians and one of the founders of Cahiers du Cinéma, was something of their godfather. They disagreed on many, many things. Among them the politique des auteurs, but nonetheless Bazin recognized the genius of Godard, Truffaut, and company, and sponsored them despite their differences.
Now, coming back to the book itself, this, as I'm reading it, tell me if I'm incorrect here. It seems like all of this sprang from one day with the director back in the year 2000. Is that right?
Not exactly. I mean, I had been fascinated by Godard's films for many, many years, since I was a teenager in the 1970s. The New Yorker asked me to do a profile of Godard in the year 2000, for which I traveled to Switzerland and did interview Godard, which was an odd experience.
In what, I have to ask, in what way?
He had asked me to come for 2 days, to do 2 days of interviews with him. He had been profiled in the New Yorker in the mid-70s. He was familiar with the New Yorker, and Godard has always been extremely clever in his use of the media as a way to promote his films. Even back at the time of Breathless, he had a journalist planted in his crew to report on his singular methods before the film was even released.
And that was fascinating to read. Yeah.
So he was well aware that what he was from the very beginning, he was well aware that what he was doing was really unusual, but equally importantly, he, taking a lesson from the way Jean-Paul Sartre managed to put existentialism over in Paris in the post-war period, recognized that his celebrity and his body of work were going to be unified. This was true, at the beginning of his career in 1959, and it was true when I saw him in the year 2000, when he was completing editing on a film called Éloge de l'amour, In Praise of Love, and suspected that it was time to make another appearance in the United States, in the American press. So I went to visit him at his office in Rolle, a small town on Lake Geneva, right between Lausanne and Geneva. Magnificent little town where the sky has a fantastic quality of blue and the water is really alluring, and where when you turn your back on the water, you're looking up the hills to the mountains. It's a really spectacular setting. The town has one traffic light. It's a very calm place. A place which is ideal for quiet contemplation, which has nourished his work for the last 25 or 30 years. Anyway, we did a formal interview for 3 hours, which I recorded. We stood casually in his office talking. He showed me some video material that hadn't been published yet. What he showed me was something called The Old Place, a video that he made on commission from and about the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which wasn't shown here until 2002. Then we stood around talking a little longer. Then he invited me out to dinner. We spoke in a fairly casual way. At the end of the evening, he suggested I come back the next morning at 10. We shook hands. Next morning at 10, I arrive at his office. The curtains are closed, and there's a note from him taped to me on the door, on the glass door, in which he said that he couldn't come for the second day of interviews, in which he offered mild insults to me and wished me better luck on my other interviews, because he knew I was going up to Paris to talk to some other people.
Wow.
Yeah, I wasn't thrilled about this. From a personal point of view, it didn't really matter, whether what he thought of me personally. But I had come to do a job, and it seemed to me that he had, stepped out in the middle of the job. So I wrote him a little note. He had complained in several interviews that the actor Gérard Depardieu, who had starred in his film Hélas pour moi, had left the set after 3 weeks, despite having been under contract for 6. So I compared his not showing up for the second day to his complaint about Depardieu. In any case, I passed by a few hours later and saw that my note had been taken. Spend my day in the hall doing other things, interviewing other people there, and went on to Paris to conduct other interviews and to continue work on the profile. Now, although I was at first very upset that we didn't do our second day of interviews, over time I came to realize that perhaps unintentionally Godard had done me a favor. The favor he had done me was to dispel any illusion that there was actually a personal relationship. In other words, one thing I think that does beset some writers, some critics, is their personal connection with the subject of their writing. And I think that some people do manage to write successfully about people they know well and yet keep their objectivity, their clarity of judgment, but some don't.
Mm-hmm. And it is tough. I mean, as you develop a relationship with someone that you're writing with, and you get to know them as a person rather than just a subject, it's true. I mean, it does cloud your view. Sometimes it helps, but in terms of objectivity, it's difficult. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I can definitely agree with that perspective of it.
Yes, I was not unsatisfied with the turn of events in the end. Mm. And it was after the profile appeared that the publisher of the book, the editor of the book, Riva Hocherman from Metropolitan Books in New York, called to ask whether I had ever thought of writing a book about Godard. And my answer was, well, for 25 years, but you have to ask me.
And did you ever speak to him again in this time?
I haven't spoken with him, but I have been in touch with him. I certainly wrote to him to let him know that I was going to be doing the book. I didn't hear from him immediately, but after he gave a presentation in France at Beaubourg, the Georges Pompidou Center, I wrote to him on the subject of his presentation, and he wrote me back actually a very generous note. So so I have heard from him. But there is no personal relationship. I mean, I don't stay in touch with him in the literal sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The first time through, I was kind of assuming, and I don't know where I had gotten this from. I had thought that you had done multiple interviews with him, but then I went back and checked that, and I saw, no, actually, I mean, your contact with him, your interview with him was basically that first time, and then you, correct me if I'm wrong here, but then since then, you have interviewed all kinds of people who have worked with him and been involved with him, and you've done a tremendous amount of research into things that had previously been written. Is that about right?
That's correct.
Okay. And it's amazing. I mean, I've got the book in hand, and the notes, I won't call them footnotes because, of course, they're not at the foot of the page, but the footnotes are pages and pages in very small type. So, I mean, this is all very supported, and had you been in Professor Ray's class, he'd be very proud of you, because you did a hell of a research job on this.
Oh, thank you.
What kind of things did you find out about Godard and his films? Anything that particularly surprised you as you learned things on the background of these projects and about him?
The research was full of surprises. One I already mentioned, namely that I was surprised to discover the extent to which Breathless was far more than simply a personal take on the American gangster film and actually was a self-conscious and, in my opinion, successful attempt to recreate contemporary philosophy through cinema. But in a very practical sense, I was surprised to learn that Godard had originally intended to make a film based on the novel I Am Legend.
Right. So you didn't know that going in?
I did not know that going in.
And how did you find? How did that reveal itself?
Well, Godard remains to this day, but at the time of Breathless and throughout the 1960s, Godard was a tremendous celebrity in France. He was a constant presence in French media, especially in the press. The number of interviews with him that he granted to French reporters is colossal, and he knew that that his ability to speak brilliantly, articulately, comically, his ability to speak, and he was and is a brilliant speaker, and his interviews themselves are in effect a parallel track of artistic creation, and they're fascinating to read. A bunch of them have been published in English in several volumes. One is called Godard on Godard, and there's another collection called Jean-Luc Godard interviews. I find them fascinating reading, even apart from the films. But he had the ear of certain journalists, and when he wanted to get a project going, he would drop hints to journalists in the hope that the fact of a great public interest in a project would induce producers to put money up on them.
Was he motivated, by ego to be in the newspaper or the magazines all this time? I don't think so. Actually, I think that the artist's ego, as Norman Mailer has said, was very much a part of the art world in general, especially in the 1960s. But I don't think that Godard was a celebrity hound from the perspective of enjoying being celebrated. In fact, I think the exact opposite. I think that he knew that he needed celebrity to establish a body of work that he knew would be difficult and outside the mainstream. But I think that very early on, he felt that his acclaim was actually a potential obstacle to getting work done. In other words, that he was setting up expectations that he realized it would be very, very difficult to live up to. So, for instance, at the Cannes Festival in 1960, which shortly after Breathless was released to great acclaim as well as financial success, he told a journalist interviewing him that he hoped his next film, which is called Le Petit Soldat, would be a failure, so that he could then reestablish his own proper relationship with the cinema. He was afraid. He was afraid that the expectation of constant success would actually get him away from what he was trying to do in the first place. He succeeded a little too well, as it turned out. I wondered if you had any concern in using these interviews as the base, some of the basis for your research, in that you talk about in the Breathless chapter how he would sometimes be deliberately confusing both to his actors, his actresses, his producer, that he would say one thing and do another. And I wondered if he put out that kind of playful personality when he was doing interviews as well.
I think that's true to a large extent. One interesting thing about his interviews is that he's simultaneously disingenuous and ingenuous, simultaneously very calculating and very sincere. He certainly did generate a playful persona in his interviews. But at the same time, he has always been disarmingly candid in his interviews in discussing his own life. For instance, in the run-up to Breathless, to the release of Breathless, he spoke very candidly about his own difficulties as a young man, the fact that he had stolen to support his movie-going habit, the fact that he had broken with his family. He put his life out there in a peculiarly unvarnished form in order to create a persona with which the film, when it was released, would interact. At the same time, like most creators, he lives very much in the moment, and when he speaks about the past, it's through the filter of an artistic sensibility. So very often the pressure to make the mental pressure of making a meaningful, let's say, artistic work out of his memory somewhat deforms the reality of it, which is why it was so useful to me to speak with people who had worked closely with him and whose memory of specific events was very often undeformed by an artistic sensibility, and who, because among the most important and interesting things they've ever done is to work with Godard, remembered their work with him and specific anecdotes with extreme clarity. It was very important to get third-person perspective on Godard's work.
Absolutely, and I'll say again what I said earlier, that I love the detail. You talked about in his films that you described, that the cheap cigarettes that Godard smoked and pushed upon his star Jean-Paul Belmondo. And this amused me greatly. The description of his work habits, where he would work his crew half a day so he could spend the rest of the day probably in a cafe pounding out dialogue and script details for the following day.
Mm-hmm.
This was great. Now, was this the kind of thing that was commonly known, or is this the kind of thing that comes out after reading mounds of interviews and talking to people? Where does that kind of detail come from in a book like this?
Well, he made sure that it was known at the time. When he was making Breathless, he did have a journalist planted in the crew, and he did this precisely so that his unusual methods would become common knowledge and would coalesce with the work itself. In effect, he knew that these methods, the idea of not composing dialogue in advance, but doing it, the night of the shoot, or even the day of the shoot, calling out lines to the actors while the camera was rolling, because Breathless was dubbed, by the way. Breathless was not recorded in direct sound.
Right. Yeah.
The idea of not choosing his camera angles in advance, the idea of, exactly as you said, giving vague instructions to the cameraman, giving the actors certainly no emotional indications. He would tell, an actor, bend over and tie your shoe here, or take the telephone, pretend to talk, and then walk out of the phone booth. But, no emotional inflections to the direction he was giving his actors. He was well aware that this was a singular way of working. And he was well aware that the results that it would yield would be singular. And he wanted his methods to be as familiar to the viewers of his film as, for instance, the drip painting method of Jackson Pollock were to the people who saw the paintings. The methods and the results were indissociable. And in fact, this is one of the ways in which Godard was attempting to update in the cinema the philosophy of Sartre. He wanted the creation of cinema not to feel like an industrial process or a process of engineering. He wanted it to feel like a spontaneous creation in the moment. Mm-hmm. He wanted the creator to seem engaged in real time.
Richard, what is the difference between what he did in Breathless, for example, and what some young rebellious filmmaker today might do to upend convention? Why do we respect it so much in Jean-Luc Godard and so little in, I don't know, I'm trying to think of someone, someone recently who might do something, but it doesn't resound. It doesn't hit us the same way. Was it because Godard was there first, or is there some other reason?
Well, I don't know whom we're talking about not appreciating now, but I can certainly say why what Godard did seemed so revolutionary at the time, whereas comparable projects might seem less revolutionary now. Of course, he was. The thing about Godard and his band of film lovers in the new wave is that they had imbibed countless hours of movies. They would go to the movies 3-4 times a day. They did this for a decade or more. There's one story about how when Godard and Jacques Rivette went to see Orson Welles' Macbeth the day it opened, they entered the theater at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Godard, who didn't like it quite as much, left at 10 at night, but Rivette, who really loved it, stayed for the last show till midnight. They watched endless hours of movies. So and they were brilliant critics. So when they made films that related to films, they really knew what they were talking about. Their perspective on film history was really profound. But as interestingly, Godard was the one of the new wave directors whose work was most overtly connected to film history. In effect, criticism and fiction converged in his work as they have in the work of no other filmmaker. So a young filmmaker today who is, who loves movies and has watched plenty of movies, he just can't get into the ring with these guys in terms of the knowledge of film history.
Well, there's go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, the other thing is that very rapidly, after making Breathless, Godard's point of view on the Hollywood cinema and on the history of cinema in general changed. In effect, he became aware that he was taking the conventions apart, but more or less had nothing to replace them with. And it was a very, very long struggle for him, a 15-year struggle to attempt a sort of reconstruction on historical principles. It took heavy intellectual lifting for him to rejoin both the film industry and the history of cinema in a constructive way. So when a young director now might pick up on the conventions of the classic American cinema, might make a gangster film or a musical, not only is he not necessarily as, let's say, booked up in movie history as Godard and the others in the New Wave, but his stance is in all likelihood not as critical. It's in all likelihood a big warm embrace, rather than without necessarily having critical perspective.
That would be I'm thinking like Harry Knowles from AintItCoolNews.com.
Oh, I don't know.
Now there's a there's a web chat that accompanies our live interviews, and someone named Love Larry, I don't know, that's just the handles that they take, was suggesting a couple names when I came up empty. Gus Van Sant, David Lynch, Abe Ferrara, I guess as examples of more modern American filmmakers. Is there anyone that comes to mind today? Let's say in the last 5 years, because you can't just take a single movie, but the last 5 to 10 years of American filmmakers that you would put in that who could have fit into that era, that French New Wave era, with Truffaut and Godard and.
Well, the first name that comes up is Wes Anderson. Wes Anderson is passionate about movie history.
Okay.
There's a magnificent tribute to Godard's La Chinoise in Darjeeling Limited. And like Godard, Wes Anderson makes very personal films, but symbolically.
Tell me about that. Sorry about the dog. Tell me about the tribute in Darjeeling. I can't say it. I'm sorry. Limited. I saw the movie. What aspect in there is the tribute?
Oh, I'm just thinking of one particular scene. The scene where Owen Wilson removes the bandages from his face, which is almost a direct visual quotation from a scene in La Chinoise where Jean-Pierre Léaud removes bandages from his face.
Right. I hadn't thought about that. Okay.
And the difference is, the difference is pretty funny, because in La Chinoise, Léaud, who is describing a political protest in which Chinese student wrapped bandages around his face, but actually was unhurt. It was purely a form of what Léaud described as Brechtian theater. In Darjeeling Limited, Owen Wilson removes bandages and reveals terrible wounds.
Yeah, I was going to say he was terribly damaged. Yeah, that was bad. Now, Larry is saying that he thinks that Anderson is remixing it. He doesn't think that he takes risks as much as I guess he's saying is Godard.
I'm going to get different kinds of risks.
Yeah. What other things did you discover about the director in researching the book? I kind of asked you about that earlier, but in a book that's over 600 pages, I imagine there must have been a couple other things that came up that you were not anticipating, or that particularly interested you as a longtime student of film.
One thing that interested me was the extent to which Godard's later career, was determined by his collaborations. one of the things he did when he left the film industry, he did leave the film industry in 1967 after making Weekend, was to attempt to make expressly political films, expressly left-wing or Maoist films. And he did this in the company of a young man named Jean-Pierre Gorin, who was a literary critic at Le Monde, who had never made a film before, and who knew that he wouldn't be able, at least at the time, would not be able to make films on his own, but wanted to work with Godard in order to make films together. They did make films together, rather doctrinaire pieces of work, films called Wind from the East or Struggles in Italy, a few others. But what they really did together was to have, in effect, a 24/7 film laboratory, not the kind of laboratory that processes film, but the kind of laboratory like scientists working together, doing experiments, studying, talking, thinking out loud, doing video sketches, attempting to refilm for study purposes scenes from films by Eisenstein, and studying other films from the history of cinema. And their discussions, although the films that they made seemed relatively remote from all the film viewing and film loving that Godard had done as a young man, it was their study, their research together, that when Godard attempted to make his way back to the industry in the mid to late 70s, their research provided a key intellectual impetus, a key point of view on viewing the history of cinema from a philosophical and political and, in general, analytical perspective that he used as the building blocks to come back to the movie business. And that was a big surprise to me. Okay. I was unaware of that.
Oh, well, let me ask you. I started our interview talking a little bit about how, as a student at least, hopefully it's not so much the same now, I would get a little frustrated by the efforts to over-intellectualize some films. Did you find that there was any of that? I mean, it's been, let me do the math here. We're up around just about the 50th anniversary, I guess, of Breathless. Has there been any, was there any effort that you found to over-intellectualize the man's work? And, was everything, appropriate and within, bounds?
Well, I understand the temptation. Because I understand the temptation because the films really are serious intellectual experiences, but that's not all they are. As an artist as both as ambitious and as philosophically grounded and as deeply thoughtful about the tools, conventions, practices in the medium, inevitably inspires a great deal of discussion. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he that people are inclined to intellectualize. I think that to a large extent the influence of his later films is less in the movie industry itself than in intellectual domains, in academia, in the art world. So I understand the impulse, although I think that sometimes there's a tendency to view his work in isolation from the person, in isolation from the emotional experiences that are aroused by the films. I think it's unfortunate because I know I'm enduringly moved by his films. I don't think of them as cold or heartless or mere formal experiments at all. I think, on the contrary, that he very much invested movie form with his own personal concerns. That there's always a personal and passionate element to his formal play. How much?
You obviously you do speak French. How much is lost, whether it be the films of Jean-Luc Godard or other international filmmakers? How much is lost on Americans who do not speak the original language of these films, who do not speak French, for example, when watching his movies, or Truffaut or Eric Rohmer, or don't get German new wave cinema. How much do we actually lose by not speaking the language and getting the undertone, or some of the linguistic currents that are going on?
It's an interesting question. When Godard, Truffaut, and their friends were watching movies in France in the late 40s, early 50s at the Cinémathèque at Henri Langlois' film museum, most of Langlois' prints of foreign films, of non-French films, they weren't subtitled, and most of them weren't dubbed. Most of them were original prints. So when these young men were watching Czech films or Japanese films or German films or Russian films, they were watching them in the original language without subtitles. So of course they missed. So of course they missed a great deal because they didn't necessarily speak the languages. But what they gained was the ability to focus on the image. I think most of what you lose when you watch a film with subtitles is that your eyes are locked on the bottom of the screen.
Right.
And you're not seeing everything that's going on. How much do you lose? Well, Godard's dialogue, Godard's soundtracks are extremely rich. Even more than his dialogue, there are voiceovers in his films. And because he's such a brilliant speaker, in fact, his initial intention was to be a novelist. He's a very literary man. He was brought up in effect, in cultural aristocracy. His grandfather was both a banker and the personal secretary to Paul Valéry, the great French writer. So literature and language were a fundamental part of Godard's heritage and identity. And I think that his soundtracks reflect that. So in a sense, one loses a great deal of the, one loses one significant track of Godard's artistic invention. On the other hand, not to speak the language and not to have subtitles could be a boon. It might be nice to see the films twice, once with and once without.
I think 10 years ago we'd probably be more inclined. The average person would be more inclined to see it a second time. Sadly, today with the rush and everything you're expected to keep up on, sometimes we don't make the time to do that again.
Right. Although if anything, DVDs can help with that.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking Friday night. This is going to sound a little off track, but I'll try to bring it around. Friday night, my wife and I went to see a concert. We saw Elvis Costello in concert, and as he was playing, I was thinking, don't figure this out. Go figure this out. But I was actually thinking of you and Godard, because I'm watching Costello, and for the 55 minutes that he played, the most memorable songs that he played were all essentially from his first album, something that he did 30 years ago now. And as I thought about Jean-Luc Godard, I was thinking, for most of the world, I mean, he's done all these other films. He's done, La Chinoise and A Woman is a Woman and King Lear, and you have whole chapters devoted to other films. But for a lot of the world, it still comes back to Breathless. And I wondered if that was a problem for his legacy and for you in describing his legacy.
I think it's a problem for him. I think it's I think it's a problem for him insofar as for 48 years people have been waiting for him to do a second Breathless. So yeah, I think it's a problem for him. I think that he recognized the problem early on. I think that it was the expectations of the public that had a great deal to do with his withdrawal from the French film industry. He sensed that he had done what he could do in one vein and needed to find, he had undone the history of cinema and hadn't gone back to redo it. I think that this accounts to a large extent for his, in effect, 15-year period of wandering. Many difficulties resulted from this, but artistically, he certainly hasn't stopped advancing. The problem is with largely the problem is with not even necessarily the public's expectations, but with critics' expectations. With the way that taste is guided by critics who haven't gotten past his first success.
Do we know what he thought of the American remake of Breathless with Richard Gere?
He didn't think too much of it. I think he didn't think it was very important, one way or the other. I suspect that he got paid something for it.
Yeah.
It was made at a time in his career where he was just beginning to get back into the industry after having been away from it for a while, and I'm sure he didn't mind the new flush of recognition that came with it. But I don't think it was a particularly important thing to him one way or the other.
It's interesting. It's been a while, but it seems like a year or two ago I saw it again. It was on one of the movie channels, and I watched it, and I thought, it's better than I remembered it to be. I mean, the Gear version. It should have been renamed something else. It shouldn't have borne the weight of that movie. But it wasn't bad for what it was. It just didn't hold up to that. You know what? I think we have a call here for you, Richard. If you don't mind.
Not at all.
All right. Luke, do you have a question for Richard Brody? Hello? All right, maybe not. That's all right. So I wanted to ask you about Truffaut. He was obviously a friend and a supporter of Godard. Who do you think was the more complete filmmaker?
It's a strange and sad story, the story of François Truffaut, who was born to a lower middle class family in Paris that basically neglected him, who was something of a wild child himself, and for whom the cinema was the one place he could belong. He was an outsider who fought his way in. And once he was in, he used his company, his celebrity, his prosperity as a kind of impregnable fortress, a protection against the world which he had found out very, very young was cruel. I think that one of the interesting things about Truffaut's career, and I think that he was certainly not as ambitious an artist as Godard. One of the interesting things about Truffaut, Godard, and their whole gang is that they had dreamed of making Hollywood studio films. They knew it would be financially difficult to do. Then they came to realize that the studios themselves stopped existing. But film direction is a very abstract thing to do. I mean, if you've ever been on a film set, you see that the difference between what you see happening before your eyes and the way things end up looking on the screen is tremendous. It takes a kind of engineering mentality to take all the disparate elements that are present on a film shoot and make a satisfyingly rich film. Truffaut didn't go to film school. Now, neither did Godard, Champereau, Rivette, and so forth, but he didn't go to film school, and he didn't spend a great deal of time on film sets. And so as he entered the profession and made more and more, and his shoots were more and more conventional, he worked in studios, he worked with large crews, he really didn't have the technical equipment, not the physical equipment, but the mental equipment to do all the things that the studio filmmakers of the classic era did. Now, Godard didn't have that equipment either. He didn't have the training either. But what Godard had that Truffaut didn't have were two things. On the one hand, he didn't attempt to use the studio apparatus. He attempted to make filmmaking as pliable, spontaneous, and immediate as painting or writing. So the amateurishness, the crudeness of it became part of the aesthetic, something that Truffaut would have repudiated. Second of all, although Godard did not have the, let's say, technical apparatus, he had another kind of abstract apparatus, namely philosophy. He had another form of abstraction that he could apply to film in order to get from the complexities on the set toward the results on screen. So in effect, Truffaut became very much of a mainstream director, but not quite as technically adept as the Hollywood filmmakers whose work he dreamed of reproducing. He remained a personal filmmaker. He kept on telling stories that came from his own experience, sometimes with greater success, sometimes with less success. But he was, as a critic, he was a revolutionary. But the revolution he helped make was Godard's revolution.
Well, Richard, we have just a couple minutes left. I want to change gears just a little bit and talk to you about The New Yorker, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
How long have you been writing there now?
I've been writing here freelance since 1999. I've been on staff here since 2005.
And I mean, it's a pretty exclusive publication. How did you break in?
Good fortune. I had written for several other publications, and editors here took notice and were kind enough to ask me to make an attempt. And the first attempt that I made was a review of a biography of Truffaut by the French critics Antoine Debec and Serge Toubiana. And I had the good fortune that people seemed to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's funny that after what we just discussed, that the first one was Truffaut.
Well, it's an amazing story. I mean, he's certainly a fascinating man. And it's, as Godard himself has said, it's too bad that Truffaut's life itself hasn't become a film. Because there's even more going on there than Truffaut dared to admit in his own films. Interesting.
And this is the thing I'm always curious about. And I sort of, it's one of those things like a lawyer would ask a question that he knows the answer to, but for the benefit of the people listening and maybe reading this later, how does the New Yorker decide what movies to review and which to skip? For example, this week you've reviewed the new Woody Allen movie Cassandra's Dream, but 2 weeks ago did you review Speed Racer, for example?
Well, my review of Cassandra's Dream is of the DVD release, because it's about to be released on DVD. So those are DVD notes. David Denby reviewed the Woody Allen film at the time that it came out. It's the critics themselves who decide, pretty much, of course, in consultation with the editors of the magazine, what they're going to review.
It's so sad that I didn't know that movie had even made it to the theaters. I didn't know it's DVD. Oh, that's sad. Poor Woody.
Yeah,
but how are those decisions made? I mean, how are you? Because you've only got so much space, and generally things run fairly long in the New Yorker.
Oh, it's like, I'm sure, like any magazine, there are discussions between the critics and the editors. Determinations are made. You know, what's important commercially, what's important artistically. It's a very collaborative process. This is one place where people talk to each other all the time.
Do you and Denby ever, arm wrestle, for a movie?
Oh, we certainly talk. I mean, we talk often, and like as any, as happens any place, no two writers will be in agreement on everything. I think if you refer back to his review of the film when it came out, I think he liked it less than I did.
Interesting. All right, I may go look that up now. Well, listen, Richard, it's a fascinating book. I would definitely recommend it for not just someone who has an interest in Godard, but someone who has an interest in cinema and wants to go behind the scenes of a filmmaker in a different way than you would a George Lucas or or Woody Allen for that matter. I mean, it's interesting because it culturally takes you to a different place. The book is extremely well written, and you don't actually have to know that much about Jean-Luc Godard or Jean-Luc Picard really to enjoy the book, and I think that's really kind of a triumph for you, I think, in that regard. So,
thank you very much. I'm glad you feel that way.
Yeah. Well, and as I say, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Really appreciate
I'm glad
your
to have spoken with you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. And you can find Richard Brody's book, Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard, available for sale on the Mr. Media site or Amazon.com. You can also catch up on the latest film reviews by Brody in pages of the New Yorker magazine or online at www.newyorker.com. Now, for dozens more celebrity and media newsmaker interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com, where you can listen to my earlier conversations with the stars and creators of Army Wives, 24, The Big Bang Theory, Pearls Before Swine, Tell Me You Love Me, and many others, or read full transcriptions of those interviews. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Blueberry, Zencast, or iTunes. And come back later this week, where I'll be talking to Tom Farley, brother of former Saturday Night Live comedian Chris Farley, about his new book, which I thought I had handy here. Here it is, The Chris Farley Show. And folks, as always, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you spending a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.